All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipovich Show is my good friend Ari Berman. Ari's work has appeared in the New York Times, Rolling Stone, The Guardian. He is a contributing writer for The Nation magazine, which you can find at thenation.com. You can also follow him on Twitter at Ari Berman. Ari, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Thanks for having me back, Matt.
All right, so Ari, since the Supreme Court in June struck down key portions of the Voting Rights Act, we have actually seen certain states ratcheting up efforts at disenfranchising voters. You recently wrote about those efforts in Arizona and Kansas and how they actually date back to the Antebellum South. Tell us about it.
Well, what happened in Arizona and in Kansas is before the Supreme Court decided a case in the Voting Rights Act, they decided another case that concerned a proof of citizenship law in Arizona. So Arizona basically says you have to show some sort of citizenship documents in order to register to vote. Kansas subsequently passed a similar law. Now that conflicts with the 1993 National Voter Registration Act, which basically says that if you register using this federal form, you have to sign and state you're an American citizen under penalty of perjury, but then you can register to vote. You don't have to show a passport, for example. But Arizona and Kansas were saying, no, you should have to show proof of citizenship to be able to register to vote, even if you use this federal form. The Supreme Court disagreed with those states and said that, in fact, the federal form had to be accepted by Arizona. So what Arizona and Kansas did in response to the Supreme Court decision is they said, okay, fine, people who register to vote using this federal form, they cannot vote in state and local elections. We're going to set up a two-tiered voter registration system, and they can only vote in federal elections. Now, this dates back to stuff that happened in the Jim Crow South, because what happened is that states like Mississippi in 1890 set up very similar two-tiered registration systems. One of many ways they disenfranchised minority voters in that state and in states across the South through things like poll taxes, literacy tests. But the whole idea is if you prevent people from registering to vote, they can't participate in the political process. And now states like Arizona and Kansas are doing a modified version of what Mississippi did back in the 1890s.
What is the, I know that it's all coming, it's coming from a racist place, but what is their logical argument of saying, okay, you can vote in a federal election, but not a local election? What are they saying the actual difference is? Is it just because the way the Supreme Court worded the ruling, essentially? Or what's the logic behind that?
They're saying that Congress has jurisdictions only over federal elections, and that they can control state and local elections. So the Supreme Court decision only applies to federal elections. And so they're basically arguing that they can do whatever they want on the state level, and they're justified in setting up this two-tiered voting system.
Wow. So where did these ideas actually come from? I know it dates back to Jim Crow, but where does it actually come from now? Like, who are the politicians who are actually pushing this now in Arizona and Kansas?
Well, it really comes from first, it started in Arizona, but the brainchild of proof of citizenship laws is Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach. And he has really fused anti-immigrant rhetoric with voter fraud paranoia. So basically, his argument is that there's all these illegal immigrants who are registered and voting in American elections, and that's why we need to tighten voter registration and require new documentation for citizenship that wasn't previously required. Now, there's absolutely no evidence to support his claim. There's no evidence that illegal immigrants are registering to vote. There's no evidence they're voting. It's sort of a ludicrous hypothetical. I mean, if you're an illegal immigrant, presumably you're in the country to work for that reason only. So why would you risk a felony conviction to vote? It makes absolutely no sense, and there's no data to back it up. But in places like Arizona and places like Kansas, this kind of anti-immigrant demagoguery has legs, and this is a broader way that politicians are trying to restrict the right to vote by basically saying that people are taking advantage of what should be an American privilege.
You also wrote on how some of this also kind of stems from even back in the 1820s and 1830s, just the kind of general idea that was going around that states had the right to flat out reject federal laws that they deemed unconstitutional. Talk a little about that.
That idea originates with a guy named John Calhoun from South Carolina who was vice president. He was a senator, and his whole idea was that states could reject laws that they viewed as unconstitutional. He was fighting basically federal tariffs, which he viewed as, sort of one step closer to federal domination of the Antebellum South, and they and he were trying to preserve slavery and the so-called Southern way of life. And basically, Calhoun's idea of nullification helped inspire the Confederacy to bolt the Union, and it also inspired, for example, Southern Democrats in the 1950s to launch this policy of massive resistance to desegregating public schools, to voting rights, to a whole host of civil rights laws, and really fight those laws as long as they could until the courts and the Congress stepped in and made it impossible for them to do that any longer. And we're really seeing this policy of nullification return with the Tea Party, with opposition to things like Obamacare. And I think that the response to the Supreme Court's decision and the response to the National Voter Registration Act is basically to say, well, fine, Congress passed this law, but we don't like it, so we're just going to ignore it. I think that's a very slippery slope, because there's a whole lot of laws right now that the Tea Party doesn't like. And are they just going to ignore all of them? I think at some point you have to wonder kind of what is the intellectual basis here. Even if people in Arizona and Kansas, they're not Southern-style racists, but they're embracing an ideology that was originating in the Antebellum South with some very dark and disturbing racial overtones.
I wouldn't even let them so much off the hook there. I would say that a lot of these laws that they're going are clearly racist against Latinos and a fear of Latino voters and stuff. So you're probably you're being kinder to them than I would.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it that if you look just more broadly at the broader, effort to restrict the right to vote, who knows whether it's motivated by racial animus or it's just motivated by political power, by trying to make it harder for people who don't look like you and who don't vote like you to be able to register and vote. But whatever the motives, it's certainly true that if you look at all these voting restrictions, whether it's proof of citizenship laws or voter ID laws or cutbacks in early voting, everything that's really happened since the 2010 election, these all disproportionately hurt communities of color. And so I think there's definitely a trend there that politicians are trying to manipulate the electoral process to make certain groups of people, particularly communities of color, to make it harder for them to vote.